All right, good evening. Thank you everyone for coming this evening. I'm Nicholas Baer, an associate professor in the German department here at Berkeley, and I'd like to thank the Center for Jewish Studies for sponsoring tonight's event, and special thanks to Etta Heber and Jennifer Lipscomb of CJS for their organizational efforts. It's my great pleasure to introduce and welcome tonight's speaker, Noah Isenberg, though it's less of a welcome than a welcome back, since Isenberg is an alum of Cal, who's undoubtedly one of our German department's most illustrious alumni. Isenberg is the Charles Sapp Centennial Professor of Radio, Television, Film at the University of Texas at Austin. He also now serves as executive director of UT's two study away centers in Los Angeles and in New York City, where he's currently based. He's a multidisciplinary scholar of German and Austrian studies, Jewish studies, and film and media studies, and he's a leading expert on topics such as Weimar cinema and culture, Jewish émigrés in Hollywood, and film noir and other traditions of American filmmaking. Isenberg's first book, Between Redemption and Doom, The Strains of German Jewish Modernism, appeared with University of Nebraska Press in 1999, and he then pivoted to the Austrian Jewish émigré filmmaker Edgar Ulmer. So Isenberg wrote a book on Ulmer's classic film noir, Detour, which appeared with the British Film Institute's Film Classic series in 2008. And he authored the monograph, Edgar Ulmer, A Filmmaker at the Margins, which appeared with the University of California Press in 2014 and was named a Best Film Book of the Year by the Huffington Post. Subsequently, Isenberg wrote on one of the most classic of all Hollywood films, Casablanca, also a film that's informed by émigré histories. So his book will always have Casablanca, the life, legend, and afterlife of Hollywood's most beloved movie, appeared with Norton in 2017 and became a Los Angeles Times bestseller. So Isenberg has also been very active as an editor of numerous volumes. He translated and edited German Jewish writer Arnold Zweig's The Face of East European Jewry with UC Press in 2004. He edited the essay collection Weimar Cinema, an essential guide to classic films of the era with Columbia University Press in 2009. And he edited and introduced a recent anthology of Billie Wilder's early journalistic writings, Billie Wilder on Assignment, Dispatches from Weimar Berlin and Interwar Vienna with Princeton University Press in 2021. And this volume was selected by the playwright Tom Stoppard as a 2021 Book of the Year in the Times Literary Supplement. And currently, Isenberg is completing two related projects on Billie Wilder. So first is the cultural history of Some Like It Hot and the Great American Sex Comedy for Norton. And second is an interpretive biography of Wilder for the Jewish Live series of Yale University Press. And of course, we'll hear more about Billie Wilder this evening. Now, as is clear, Isenberg bridges the gap between academic and public-facing writing. He's the rare scholar who writes with an equal measure of rigor and flair, and he brings painstaking archival research to life through vivid and engaging prose. Alongside all of the publications I've mentioned, Isenberg regularly contributes to journals such as New York Review of Books, The Nation, The New Republic, Wall Street Journal, Book Forum, and New York Times Book Review. So if there are students in the audience wondering what you can do with a German degree from Berkeley, I think the answer is Noah Isenberg's career. So tonight, Isenberg will give a lecture, and then we'll have plenty of time for interactive Q&A, and we hope as many of you participate in the discussion as possible. His talk is entitled Runnin Wild, Billie Wilder, Hot Jazz in Weimar Jewish Culture. Please join me in welcoming Noah Isenberg.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the very, very kind introduction. It's great to see everyone. It's great to be back in Berkeley. Can't believe it was 30 years ago that I finished my degree here. The talk that I'm giving tonight is in this little manila folder, but before I get to it, I just want to say a number of thank yous. First and foremost to Nick Baer for the very generous invitation, the Center for Jewish Studies, to Jennifer Lipscomb in the Center for Jewish Studies who helped coordinate everything. I also want to say, and you can hear me okay? Did that? Okay, I'm just making sure. Good. Very important. I have a number of mentors and teachers who are here in the room, and I just want to thank them for setting my career in motion. Marty J is sitting up here in the front, Tony K is sitting there in the back, and I wouldn't be where I am without them, and so heartfelt thanks. The talk that I'm giving tonight, you heard a bit from Nick about my checkered career. And this is definitely something that falls more squarely in the public facing. It's in the public facing space and aimed much more at a popular audience than a scholarly audience. It's a book that I'm now in the process of finishing. I'm in the final throes. My editor wishes that it was done last night, but it's for the same editor that I wrote the Casablanca book for Norton. And if you're wondering why it's taken me a little bit of time, he just said after the Casablanca book hit the LA Times bestseller, just do that again, would you please? Just do that. And I'm like, okay, sure, no problem. The talk tonight begins with an epigraph from Scott Fitzgerald's Echoes of the Jazz Age from 1931. It reads as follows. The word jazz, in its progress toward respectability, has meant first sex, then dancing, then music. It is associated with a state of nervous stimulation, not unlike that of big cities behind the lines of war. Late in life, Billy Wilder recounted how he first sold one of his original stories written for the screen. He was then living at the time, he was living at the time near the end of the 1920s when he himself was in his 20s, in one of several single occupancy rooms in a family home at Victoria Luise Platz in the Schöneberg section of Berlin. It was not far from Kurfürstendamm, the city's majestic boulevard, nor from the Romanisches Café, where he spent long days schmoozing, talking his way into a card game or an argument, and trying to hatch new ideas with his fellow journalists and aspiring screenwriters. To maintain a sense of decorum, the boarding house rules dictated that no women were allowed in a man's room. But the owner's daughter, quite easy on the eyes in Wilder's telling, whose room shared a wall with his, was known to bring up male suitors. Among them was a certain Maxim Galician-born, a movie producer, head of Maxim Film, and a nightclub owner. One fateful night, a half-dressed Herr Galician-born, nearly caught in flagrante, hiding from the angry proprietor. Where is he, that son of a bitch? I'm going to kill him, is the way that Wilder recalled the exchange. Found himself standing in young Billy's room. Never one to miss an opportunity, Billy turned on the light and confronted the man, whom he immediately recognized. Mr. Galician-born, he blurted out. I'm a writer. I happen to have an original story. Galician-born purportedly told the aspiring screenwriter to come see him at the studio the next day. But that wasn't good enough for the supremely crafty, enterprising young man. With one hand on the door, flaunting his ability to open it at any time, thus revealing the suitor on the lam, Billy didn't budge. Tomorrow, the secretary's not even going to announce me, he told Galician-born, and it has to be done now. He completed the business transaction, managing to squeeze 2,000 marks, or roughly 300 in today's dollars, out of the producer, who, as Wilder has it, didn't even leave with the story in hand. From that day onward, the connection between sex and storytelling, or in this case, story selling, was integral for Wilder. After all, he'd landed his first job as a cub reporter at Vienna's popular tabloid, Die Bühne, the stage, by barging in on the paper's theater critic, Dr. Hans Liebstöckel, having sex with his secretary one Saturday afternoon. In Wilder's account, likely as embroidered as other tall tales he repeated in numerous interviews that he gave near the end of his career, had Dr. Liebstöckel looked him in the eye, zipping up his fly, and tartly responded, "You're lucky I was working overtime." Wilder himself attributed the back pains he suffered from as an old man from doing plenty of overtime in Vienna, mostly standing up in doorways. He was soon filing crossword puzzles, and here I have just a couple. This will hopefully keep you awake at this hour in the day. I've got a lot of slides and a good handful of clips or so. This is young Billy working as a journalist in Vienna just before he turned 20, so he's still 19 at the time. And here I have also a visiting card. He wrote for the two main tabloids. I mentioned Die Bühne, the other one is Die Stunde, the hour. So you have the stage and the hour. And among the assignments, very distinguished assignments, was to file crossword puzzles. He was soon filing crossword puzzles and capsule reviews, covering all manner of Viennese nightlife, including its burgeoning jazz scene, for the city's two leading tabloids I just referenced a moment ago, Die Bühne and Die Stunde, and turning in copy at a rapid clip. Indeed, it was jazz, that often erotically charged obsession of his, that had brought him to Berlin in the first place. In summer of 1926, on the eve of his 20th birthday, young Billie, as he then still spelled his name, and you see how he spelled it, Billie, followed the American band leader, Paul Whiteman, and his orchestra on their European tour. It's hard not to think of Cameron Crowe's Almost Famous substituting the jazz scene of the Roaring Twenties Berlin for the rock and roll scene of the 1970s Los Angeles. And for those of you who know Cameron Crowe's film, here's a scene from that fateful journey from Vienna to Berlin in the summer of 1926. He's the second from right. You can see how he's got his snap brim hat on, trying to exude a sense of confidence in I think very much the pose of the hard-boiled American-styled reporter. More on that in just a bit. He ended up staying for a 7-year stretch, working as a freelance reporter and a budding screenwriter, until his final hasty exodus from the Hitler regime in February of 1933. To go to Berlin, observed historian Peter Gay in Weimar Culture, The Outsider as Insider, was, and I continue to quote now from Peter Gay, the aspiration of the composer, the journalist, the actor, with its superb orchestras, its 120 newspapers, its 40 theaters. Berlin was the place for the ambitious, the energetic, the talented. Wherever they started out, it was Berlin that they became and Berlin that made them famous. Those words of Peter Gay. Wilder often claimed that those were the most formative and in many ways the happiest years of his life. Setting Some Like It Hot in the 1920s and in Al Capone's Chicago, principally used as a means of justifying the otherwise unthinkable decision of two straight male musicians to dress as women, enabled Wilder to rekindle his passion for jazz and for the decadent nightlife that he experienced firsthand in Weimar Berlin. In Karen Thomas's documentary, Cinema's Exiles, a documentary from 2009, German-born film editor Rudy Fehr, himself an aspiring jazzman during the Weimar years, and a future member of Wilder's cohort of Hollywood transplants, proudly recounts how he attended all 3 of the 4 concerts that Whiteman gave in Berlin, a cultural phenomenon that anticipated the level of frenzied anticipation of Beatlemania. Legions of young German jazz fans were entirely besotted. Wilder's early newspaper reporting on the sold-out premiere of Berlin's legendary Großes Schauspielhaus auditorium, the piece was titled Whiteman Triumphs in Berlin, written for Die Stunde, matches Rudy Fehr's recollection. He observes in the audience, and I quote now from Wilder's piece on Paul Whiteman's concert at das Große Schauspielhaus in Berlin, he observes in the audience a state of feverish excitement, endless streams of cars snaking their way from the Brandenburg Gate to the Potsdamer Platz. All of Berlin has gathered together. Berlin is dressed to the nines, all of those young Billy Wilder's words. In attendance, and I should say, before I take credit for rendering that into English, this is all Shelley Frisch, a very, very talented translator with whom I worked on Billy Wilder on assignment, so kudos to Shelley. In attendance that night, according to Wilder, were Prince Joachim of Prussia, high-level diplomats from the American, French, and British embassies, the editors and music critics from all of Berlin's leading broadsheets and tabloids, UFA Studios megastar Emil Jannings, violinist Fritz Kreisler, and an army of Berlin-based musicians, many of them assimilated Jews like Wilder, who were suddenly under the spell of American jazz. That fabled night, Whiteman and his band members played ragtime, Dizzy Fingers, a foxtrot, and a beloved piece called Madonna, sometimes referred to as My Moonlight Madonna, which, in Wilder's words, starts like a barcarolle and ends with a Charleston that sets your legs a-twitter. And more on dancing in just a bit. But the young writer reserves his ultimate praise for a number that Whiteman had made famous in the United States in the months leading up to the Berlin concerts, a smash hit by George Gershwin. I quote now again from Wilder's review. In Rhapsody in Blue, he writes, a composition that created quite a stir over in the States. It is an experiment in exploiting the rhythms of American folk music. When Whiteman plays it, it is a piece of artistry. He has to do encores again and again. The normally standoffish people of Berlin are singing his praises. People stay on in the theater for half an hour after the concert. For jazz, against jazz, the most modern of all music, kitsch, art, necessity, an essential regeneration of Europe's calcified blood. Those are all Wilder's words. Whiteman was among the most widely acclaimed jazz band leaders of the era, and among the first, along with clarinetist Sidney Bechet, who toured Paris with the band that accompanied Josephine Baker the year before, to bring jazz to Europe. He was often said to have made a lady out of jazz. His symphonic ballroom renditions relying on the damp rhythms and minimal improvisation, which jazz critic Gary Giddens explains, meant that up until that point, jazz, with its provocative and promiscuous style, had elicited widespread social and sexual panic among conservatives, much in the manner of a prostitute. And there's a picture of a close-up of Paul Whiteman, sometimes, as you'll hear from me in just a second, referred to as the king of jazz. In the early years of Whiteman's European tour, there were numerous articles in the American popular press excoriating what they regarded as the morally corrosive nature of jazz. One of the most awful and inexcusable of musical sins ever committed against the face of the people, as one critic wrote. Ladies' Home Journal ran a cover article in 1921 with the incendiary title, "Does Jazz Put the Sin in Syncopation?" The moral outrage was driven by acute fears of miscegenation, sparked by the radical integration of jazz clubs, and still more radical, by the interracial dancing that scandalously took place on urban dance floors. In the age of Prohibition, jazz also became a target of ire among law enforcement officials who feared its perceived invitation to unrestrained and licentious behavior, with the so-called Cotillo Bill aimed at regulating and restricting public, that is to say, mixed dance halls in New York City, introduced in 1921, and early black jazz releases given the appellation race records. In 1924, Whiteman assembled a program, an experiment in modern music, at New York's Aeolian Hall, which featured the debut of Gershwin's A Rhapsody in Blue, about which you heard young Wilder wax rhapsodic, as it were, and which brought jazz into a larger conversation with classical and symphonic music. Here's a scene from 45. Warner Brothers, it was such a success that Warner Brothers decided to do a biopic here of Gershwin and his story debut, and you can see the mixed audience there in attendance in New York City, which brought jazz into the larger conversation of classical and symphonic music. And I interviewed Gary Giddens, the jazz critic, and this is a quote from him. He says, as he puts it, by making those European travels, and this is now Paul Whiteman, of course, he may have been bringing compromised jazz, but he brought jazz nonetheless. That same year, the same year that Wilder met Whiteman in Vienna and followed him with his band onward to Berlin, Whiteman published his autobiography, the simply titled Jazz, co-written with Mary McBride. Jazz is the spirit of a new country, he wrote, the essence of America. Although Whiteman had his share of outspoken detractors regarding cultural appropriation and the like, none other than Duke Ellington remarked in 1943, and I quote from Duke, "Don't let them kid you about Whiteman. He's been a big man in our music. He's done a lot for it," end quote from Duke Ellington. He may not have earned the publicity-generated honorific, the King of Jazz, which spawned the eponymous 1930 musical for Universal Pictures, starring Whiteman and aimed at further popularization, but he was, as cultural critic Terry Teachout noted in a recent reappraisal of Whiteman, the king of the jazz age. Marking what he considered the greatest years of his life, the jazz-saturated capital of Weimar, Germany, was the place that Wilder already showed early signs of Americanophilia. He was able to rehearse for his later migration. Or put differently, the American-influenced metropolis of Berlin, remarks film scholar Gert Gemünden, gave Wilder the chance to reinvent himself. Those are his words. It was here, too, that the hyper-ambitious young journalist, filing a string of jaunty, mordant, self-stylized pieces on Deadline, And here a shameless plug for Billie Wilder on assignment. If you're curious about the writings of young Billie, out in paper. End of plug. Landed a job dancing with wealthy older ladies at the Eden Hotel, one of the city's most luxurious establishments. Picture the sleek deco interiors of Edmund Goulding's Grand Hotel, the 1932 Academy Award-winning MGM adaptation of fellow Viennese Jewish writer Vicky Baum's runaway bestseller. It was the kind of place where cocktails were given names like the Louisiana Flip, as they're called in the film I just made, both the novel and the film, where frenetic Charleston was all the rage, and where the ephemeral and contingent nature of modern life found their match in a world of shiny surface splendor. As luck or fate would have it, Wilder had an American girlfriend, a touring dancer named Olive Victoria, whom he met during his early years in Berlin, and who provided him with a crash course in American jazz-age dance numbers. It was the 20s, he recalled for Cameron Crowe, and I gave lessons in Charleston. As the contemporary critic, and I'm about to quote at length, and again, another hat tip to my teachers here, I'm about to quote at length from a piece by Katharina Rathaus. This is a piece from the mid-1920s. It's called Charleston, Every Age Has the Dance It Deserves, but it appears in the Weimar source book, co-edited by two luminaries here in our midst. And as a lowly graduate student, I think I did a little bit of research for that one, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure I've been paid, Tony. We got to talk about that later, but we'll figure that one out. Published the piece in the prominent Weimar-era cultural magazine Uhu just a few weeks before Wilder arrived in Berlin with Paul Whiteman. I quote now from Katharina Rathaus's piece from the Weimar source book. The waltz is dead, and all attempts to resuscitate it are failing and destined to fail. For the times have changed, and with them, like a natural necessity, so must the dances. They are creatures of the new mobility of life, of its whipped up and racing tempo. They are full of the new spirit, and the new should not be judged, good or bad, too quickly. The notion that the good of the good old time is marked by a fear of the new, and skepticism over the new dances usually goes along with an inability to dance them. And as the new is always the slogan of the young, this is something that's resonated with me recently in New York City on Tuesday, so does the new generation fasten its excited grip on the new dances. It senses that the empty bowls of old Europe will offer no new nourishment for the blood, that the burned-out temperament of the European centers of culture can convey to body no unsuspected electrifying rhythm. End of quote from Katharina Rathaus. For the writer, for Rathaus, the division between the old regime and the new couldn't be any clearer as it concerns dance, which through her eyes is frequently enacted amid the thunder of a jazz band like a storm, evoking an almost revolutionary quality. It cleanses tradition of the dust of decades, she asserts, inflames blasé dance fanatics anew, shows all those excited by dance the rhythm of their life, their feelings, and their thoughts. It answers to the name Charleston. And you'll hear a bit more about the Charleston in just a bit, and I even have a clip that will enact that wonderful dance, and that very, very popular dance. Among the many stories that Wilder wrote for the Berlin newspapers in the mid to late 1920s was a 4-part confessional of his experiences of working as a so-called Eintänzer, dancer for hire, at the posh Eden Hotel. He may as well have titled the series Ballroom Confidential. Wilder wrote his story on an old typewriter, recalled his fellow journalist chum Paul Erich Marcus, who used to publish under his pen name Pem. Inventing most of his adventures, says Paul Erich Marcus, because his job wasn't nearly so exciting as the poet had imagined. True or embellished, the series, commissioned by the Berliner Zeitung am Mittag and published in several issues from January of 1927, later reprinted in Die Bühne, covered his experiences on his feet. It bore an epigraph from one of his Berlin mentors, the writer Alfred Henschke, who published under the nom de plume Klabund and was married to the prominent cabaret and theater actress Carola Neher. In it, Klabund advised young writers gesturing towards the contemporary aesthetic trend of Neue Sachlichkeit, or new objectivity, to write to write about events as they really occurred. I quote now from Klabund. The only thing that still interests us today about literature is the raw materials it's made of. Life, actuality, reality. The motto vitalism is, every living thing is but a metaphor. So much from the epigraph. Since it's Wilder, of course, the truth is mixed with a healthy dose of droll, acerbic wit and charming poetic license as he recounts the gritty details of his trade, the wealthy ladies of leisure who seek his services, the jealous husbands who scowl at him, and the grueling hours of labor on the dance floor, doing the latest in jazz-inflected dance steps. I wasn't the best dancer, Wilder later admitted, but I had the best dialogue. Early in the first installment, he includes a review of his performance attributed to the hotel management. And here, by the way, sorry, I said that you'd see more of Charleston. Here's oh, where'd it go? Sorry, there we go. This is a kind of a photo montage that I meant to show you when I referenced the Charleston moments ago. And here's that four-part series. Herr Ober, bitte einen Tänzer. Waiter, a dancer, please. Was the name of that. Early in the first installment, he includes a review of his performance attributed to the hotel management that in many ways serves as an approximation of his future career as a writer-director in Hollywood. Herr Wilder, Herr Wilder as he was called at the time, knew how to adapt to the fussiest audiences in every way in his capacity as a dancer. He achieved success in his position and always adhered to the interests of the establishment. End quote. He put the skills he acquired on the dance floor to excellent use on the page and ultimately on the screen, always with an eye toward his audience and toward ensuring his path to success. I say to myself, I'm a fool, he writes in a moment of intense self-awareness in that series. Sleepless nights, misgivings, doubts. The revolving door has thrust me into despair. That's for sure. Outside it's winter. Friends from the Romanisches Café, all with colds, are debating sympathy and poverty, and just like me yesterday, have no idea where to spend the night. I, however, am a dancer. The big, wide world will wrap its arms around me. In the ballroom, slender-legged women sit at small tables sipping mocha cafe. They're putting their cups down and sizing me up, their crimson lips puckered in a honeyed, peeved smile. All that from what you see on the screen here. The affinities between the 20-something Billie as down-and-out dancer and the big dreaming but equally destitute jazz-age musicians he'd bring to life in Some Like It Hot abound. I'm going to show you just one clip here. This is from the scene when Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon go to visit Sig Polyakov, played by Billy Gray here, when they visit him at MCA and they're trying to scrounge up work. So I think it resonates with some of what I was just getting at.
Distance. Look, since we want to talk to you. What is it? Yes, about the Florida job. The Florida job? Mm-hmm. Nellie told us all about it. Yeah, we're not too late, are we? What are you, a couple of comedians? Get out of here. Long distance, get me to William Morris Agency in New York. Well, you need a bass and a sax, don't you? The instruments are right, but you're not. I want to speak to Mr. Morris. Wait a minute, what's wrong with us? You're in the wrong shape. Goodbye. The wrong shape? What are you looking for, hunchbacks or something? It's not the backs that worry me. Well, what kind of a band is it anyway? You gotta be under 25. We can pass for that. You gotta be blonde. We could dye our hair. And you gotta be girl. We could. No, we couldn't. Mr. William Morris. Wait a minute, you mean this is a girls' band? Yeah, that's what he means. Good old Nellie. I could wring a neck. I'm holding on. Let's talk this thing over, Joe. Why couldn't we do it, huh? Last year, when we worked in the Gypsy Tea Room, we wore gold earrings, didn't we? Remember when you booked us with the Hawaiian band? We wore grass skirts. What's with him? He drinks. No, but he ain't been eating so good either. He's got an empty stomach and it's gone to his head. Joe, this is 3 weeks in Florida. We could borrow some clothes from the girls in the chorus. You flip your wig. Now you're talking. Now he is talking. We've got a couple of second-hand wigs, little padding here and there. We call ourselves Josephine and Geraldine. Josephine and Geraldine. Yeah. Come on. Look, if you boys want to pick up a little money tonight, at the University of Illinois they're having, you should pardon the expression, of St. Valentine's dance. We'll take it. You got it. $6 a man. Be on the campus at Urbana at 8 o'clock. Oh, but wait to Urbana for a one-night stand. It's $12. We can get one of the overcoats at a hock. Hello, Mr. Morris. This is Polyakov in Chicago. Say, you wouldn't happen to have a couple of girl musicians available, would you? A sax player and a bass? Look, if William Morris doesn't come through... Come on, Geraldine.
Polyakov is a fascinating character. I could go on at him about him ad nauseum tonight. I'm not going to, but his speech is always peppered with various Yiddishisms. There's a woman he's trying to book for this gig, and she can't play because now she's playing for the Philharmonic. Spielt sich für die Philharmonies, what is the response. He's always trying to incorporate various forms of Yiddish speech in the dialogue. He's your classic agent, and again, I could say more about him maybe during the Q&A, but I'm endlessly fascinated by Billie Gray, who began as a Borscht Belt comedian and makes his way into this picture as the agent Polyakov. The jazz-happy journalist was an avid consumer of Weimar Berlin nightlife, a favorite topic of Wilder's reporting from the period, and of the animated conversations held at the Romanisches Café. It was a refuge, he recalled, in a renowned coffee house many decades later. We lived there, especially here. I have just a quick image of the Romanisches Café. We lived there, especially the bachelors. There were writers who wrote there, newspaper people, chess players, and card players. If it rained or shined, you took refuge there. We lived there more than in our own houses. It was a second home, a first home, really. Wilder had even harbored some hope of making a movie about the café one day, but that never came to fruition. And one of his early collaborators, Robert Siodmak, writes in his memoirs, they collaborated, and I'm going to say a little bit about People on Sunday in just a bit, but he and his brother, they had their coats in hock, and he writes about how they were really, really struggling. And at the Romanisches Café, one of the things you were famous for is you could get one cup of coffee and you could sit there all day long. You could read the newspapers hanging on the rack, and that's why they would gather there. There's a rather famous oft-cited passage from Stefan Zweig's memoir, Die Welt von Gestern, World of Yesterday, that conjures up the atmosphere of Wilder's Berlin in vivid, if slightly exaggerated, terms. I quote from Zweig now. Berlin was transformed into the Babylon of the world. Bars, amusement parks, honky-tonks sprang up like mushrooms. Along the entire Kurfürstendamm, powdered and rouged young men sauntered, and they were not all professionals. Every high school boy who wanted to earn some money in the dimly lit bars, one might see government officials and men of the world of finance tenderly courting drunken soldiers without any shame. Even the Rome of Suetonius had never known orgies as the pervert balls of Berlin, where hundreds of men costumed as women and hundreds of women as men danced under the benevolent eyes of the police. So much from Zweig. Despite the seeming gender fluidity of Berlin, or perhaps because of it, the city itself took on some of the same seductive sheen as its inhabitants. Playwright Karl Zuckmayer, for instance, once remarked, "People desire Berlin as if the city were a highly desirable woman. They called her proud, snobbish, nouveau riche, uncultured, crude, but secretly everyone looked upon her as the goal of his desires. Some saw her as hefty, full-breasted, in lace underwear, others as a mere wisp of a thing, with boyish legs and black silk stockings. The daring saw both aspects, and her very reputation for cruelty made them more aggressive. To conquer Berlin was to conquer the world." So much from Zuckmayer. As much of the source material for Some Like It Hot is consumed, even to the point of outright obsession with gender in all its ambiguous iterations, it practically elides the question of race. There is, in other words, a total absence of blackness in the 1959 film. Sure, it's all over the screen, in the soundtrack, the dance numbers, the sensibility, but nowhere in the picture. Wilder was acutely aware and indeed enamored of the black jazz musicians and dance performers who toured Europe in the 1920s, just as he was increasingly swept up in the Charleston, the Black Bottom, the shimmy, and other dance crazes that took Europe by storm. In Wilder's Berlin, there was a significant wave of touring black jazz shows, from the Chocolate Kitties Review, which ran for 2 consecutive years and introduced Berliners to the music of Duke Ellington, to the spectacularly popular band leader Sam Wooding and his Chocolate Dandies Orchestra, several of whose songs were recorded for the Berlin-based jazz label Vox. The Berlin radio stations were famous for their jazz programming, writes Phyllis Rose of the German scene of the 1920s, with many live broadcasts from Berlin night spots. In 1927, I'm continuing to quote from Rose here, The weekly program guide ran instructions on how to dance the tango, the Charleston, the black bottom, and the foxtrot. And then, of course, there was the sensation sparked by Josephine Baker, the subject of Rose's magisterial jazz Cleopatra, who burst onto the European scene in the mid-1920s. Born less than 3 weeks apart in June of 1906, Baker in St. Louis and Wilder in the small Galician town of Sucha, roughly 30 miles southwest of Krakow, the two have far more in common than one might otherwise think. As a 19-year-old dancer, Baker traveled to Europe in late 1925, touring with the famous Revue Negre and accompanied by such jazz giants as clarinetist I've mentioned him before, Sidney Bechet, in Paris at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées. Just a few years after her arrival, she would make her way to Berlin, to the Theater am Kurfürstendamm, just as Wilder himself was beginning his career as a journalist and falling more madly in love with American jazz. Baker rode in on a cresting wave of negrophilia, or negritude as it's called in the Francophone Europe, charged with the currents of cultural exoticism, primitivism, and almost a fetish-like attraction to blackness. From Paris to Berlin, where she enjoyed an equally receptive, if not more receptive, audience in the German capital. I found it dazzling, Baker later recounted of her Berlin performances in the winter of 25-26. The city, and I continue to quote now from Josephine Baker, the city had a jewel-like sparkle, especially at night, that didn't exist in Paris. The vast cafes reminded me of ocean liners, powered by the rhythms of their orchestras. There was music everywhere. Word of our success at the Champs-Élysées had preceded us, and we were greeted with great excitement. I think also about the premiere of Rhapsody in Blue by the Paul Whiteman Orchestra in Berlin just a little bit later in terms of that excitement, that enthusiasm. The reviews match that sentiment, even if they struggled to classify the act. In her, the wildness of her forefathers, wrote a critic for the Berliner Tageblatt, who were transplanted from the Congo Basin to the Mississippi. It is preserved most authentically. She breathes life, the power of nature, the wantonness that can hardly be contained. As troubling and as cringeworthy as these reviews may seem to today's readers and today's ears, those of us who are far more attuned to the racist and colonial strains of such rhetoric, they were quite common in their day. The white imagination sure is something, observed Baker of her European admirers from the 1920s, especially when it comes to blacks. Baker's dancing, in particular her frenzied rendition of the Charleston, half clad in her signature banana skirt, captured in endless photographs, postcards, and caricatures, and printed in the German popular press, enraptured audiences in Berlin, just as she'd done in Paris before. The whole point of a review, observed one critic, is sensuality. Whoever goes to a review wants to see pretty, tantalizing clothed and unclothed girls, end quote. It was, if there ever was a symbol of hot jazz, or the jazz age more broadly, this was it. When Baker did the Charleston, writes Rose, again from Jazz Cleopatra, when Baker did the Charleston, she could throw herself completely into the dance. The metaphor of abandon was built into the Charleston. The dance, in a sense, was about letting go. It meant liberty, freedom, the throwing off of old restraints, including, of course, sexual ones. And so it was appropriately the dance of the 20s. All of that from Phyllis Rose. It was, in other words, a form of Runnin' Wild. The intense focus on her gyrating hips, captured in all manner of media from the period, sparked an enduring fascination, and in some audiences, a sense of horror. And this nearly a century before the twerking phenomenon would elicit another round of fascination and revulsion. Baker's wildly popular performances in Weimar, Berlin, brought her celebrity status, prompting writers in the popular press to rechristen her Josephine, with the German spelling, and even referring to her with the same amount of affection as die Bakerin, another familiar term of endearment. Theater impresario Max Reinhardt had seen Baker perform with the all-black dance review Shuffle Along in New York in 1924, when he was there staging the American rendition of The Miracle at the Century Theater on New York's Upper West Side. As fate would have it, that's also when Edgar G. Ulmer arrived on the same ship and helped to do the set design for The Miracle. Another interesting but tangential strand that brings the work that I'm doing on Wilder together with some of the earlier work that Nick referenced. This is again back to Max Reinhardt and not to Ulmer. He was so thoroughly taken with her performances in Berlin 2 years later that he offered her a contract to train and perform at his renowned Deutsches Theater in Berlin. The expressive control of her body, of the whole body, the spontaneity of motion, the rhythm, the bright emotional color, remarked Reinhardt of Baker. These are your treasures, not yours only. These are American treasures. With such control of the body, such pantomime, I believe I could control emotion as it has never been portrayed. This is all Max Reinhardt on Josephine Baker. Only a few short weeks after arriving in Berlin with the Whiteman Orchestra, Wilder himself reviewed an all-black female dance troupe at Berlin's Metropole Theater in July of 26. In that piece, the unfortunately titled Schwarze Girls, a title and topic that caused more than its share of well-earned consternation today, to such a degree that the translator and I actually opted not to include it in the volume, but I draw from it here tonight, and I can explain why. Wilder wrote of a certain jazz-intoxicated visitor to the show, presumably the young journalist Billie, whose byline the piece carried, filled with childlike enthusiasm, as he writes in that same piece, as the 10 alluring black girls of the troupe prepared for their number. I quote now from Wilder's piece. 20 eyes, black as ink, looked at him. 20 legs, silk stocking wrapped beauties, forced the blood to his head. As for the visitor, he bowed like a recent high school graduate, which Wilder was in fact, sat down on a tattered old chair, missed one leg and its armrest, and stammered in a mix of broken English and the cutest syrup-sweet blandishments, end quote. After a perfunctory interview recounted for laughs, with a diplomatic aside about the unduly harsh treatment of non-whites in the United States, he writes about how 10 girls finally taught him how to dance the Charleston properly. His legs were like an accordion. Sweat ran down his overheated face. He looked as if he'd just crossed the finish line of a marathon. All of that from Wilder's review. Although Wilder and Baker may never have met, there is no definitive corroboration of any account between the two, and he may or may not have caught one of her many popular performances in Berlin, the cultural moment in which they both participated and in many ways helped to shape came to a head in another flashpoint in Weimar, Germany. The jazz opera, Johnny spielt auf, Johnny Strikes Up the Band, here from Ernst Krenek. Written by Viennese composer Ernst Krenek, one of the many short-lived husbands of Alma Mahler, who had come to Berlin in the mid-1920s, roughly the same time of Wilder and Baker. His 1927 opera was a massive popular and commercial success. It was also something of a succès de scandale among its right-wing detractors who attacked its putatively un-German, culturally dubious origins and the very import of blackness. At the same time, it earned legions of fans, with several 78 RPM recordings of its songs pressed in a Berlin studio, garnering plenty of radio time, a kind of proto-Hamilton of its age. The opera, which debuted at the Stadttheater Leipzig in early February of 27, went on to enjoy more than 400 performances in 45 different cities in its first season alone. Sig Polyakov would like those numbers, I'm sure, with particularly robust runs in Berlin and Vienna. Its popularity and fanfare surrounded it were rivaled only by other publicity-driven media events that garnered big-budget UFA productions. Think, for instance, of the 27 debut, the premiere of Fritz Lang's Metropolis. The opera served, and here I'll show you. This is also from 27. There we go, a photo montage. Of Johnny spielt auf, of Johnny Strikes Up the Band. The opera served as another opportunity to pit a more stale, ossified European culture against the liberated spirit of American jazz. More imagined by Krenek, whose exposure to the jazz scene in Berlin was limited to German and Austrian musicians returning from trips to the United States. who were beginning to incorporate their variation of an American art form into their orchestral numbers. The libretto centered around a composer who represented, in Krenek's words, a ponderous, inhibited Central European intellectual, and the titular character, a black jazz musician whom Krenek here dubbed, a child of nature, totally free of inhibitions, acting on impulse at the spur of the moment. In the end, the European composer succumbs to the pull to America, just as Krenek himself, along with Wilder and company, would do after the fascist storm took hold in the mid-1930s. And here you have, by the way, I'm just going to play this at the risk of overpowering things, but this is the Entartete Musik show in Munich, just a few years later, that began to conflate music with both Jewishness and blackness, right? Equally degenerate in the eyes of the fascists who took hold of power in January of '33. An ideal match for young Billie arrived in 1928 when the Ullstein Publishing House, publisher of the Berliner Zeitung am Mittag and many other newspapers, introduced a new afternoon Boulevard Zeitung, an illustrated paper aimed at a young demographic of readers, bearing a title that would speak directly to them, Tempo. And here I'm going to show you. This is just an image of the racing reporter, a name that he took for himself, but he'd actually shamelessly borrowed from Egon Kisch, who held the Tisch von Kisch, as his table was called. You can almost think of Walter Winchell's table, and he would hold court there. But Billie took on the title of the racing reporter, and that's a sketch from him. It was a tabloid of Tempo. This is Peter Gay was talking here about Tempo in his piece, in his chapter on the German Jewish spirit of Berlin. He said it was a tabloid, racy in tone, visual in appeal, designed to please the Berliner who ran as he read. The Berliners, however, quickly adopted another name for it. They called it Jüdische Hast, Jewish haste. An inveterate pacer and a man on the move. After all, his moniker at the time was the racing reporter. Billie was a good fit for Tempo and vice versa. It was in its pages that he introduced Berliners to the short-lived independent film production company, Film Studio 1929, and the young cineasts, including Wilder himself, behind its creation. Speed is absolutely of the essence to him, observed his Weimar-era collaborator and future fellow Hollywood transplant, Walter Reich. He cannot do anything slowly. One of Wilder's earliest scripts, a story he sold to producer Joe Pasternak at Universal Pictures, was explicitly based on his experiences as a newspaper man. It was called Der Teufelsreporter, a hell of a reporter, sometimes translated as the Devil's Reporter, from 1929, and starred American actor and former circus performer Eddie Polo as a stringer at a Tempo-inspired tabloid called Rapide. Wilder has a brief cameo in the film himself, as you now see on the screen, in a group scene in which he dons a standard issue trench coat, snap brim hat, looking every bit an American-style hard-boiled reporter. He flits in and out of the frame with the same frenetic energy he'd later apply towards his film work on the other side of the Atlantic. I'm going to skip ahead here, if I may, because I want to bring things to a home, and I don't want this to become an interminable lecture. It's a long chapter. It's one of 7 chapters, and I think it's worth cutting this. Tomorrow in Tony Case's class, I'll be talking about Menschen am Sonntag. I'm going to skip over this. What I will say, and I can show you the slide, is that Billie, while he was filing these newspaper pieces at a rapid clip, he also began to distill from them certain elements that he'd apply in the screenplays that he wrote. Among them, Menschen am Sonntag, People on Sunday, crafted in the summer, the screenplay, if you can dignify it with such a term, it was really written on napkins at the Romanisches Café, but in the summer of 1929, premiering in Berlin in February of '30, really catapulted a number of very important filmmakers and their future careers in Hollywood. Billie Wilder, Fred Zinnemann, he was the youngest. He was in his everybody was in their 20s, except for Eugen Schriftan, the cinematographer. He was the old man on set in his mid-30s. But I'm going to skip over that, and instead I'm going to get us to some of the other important work that Wilder and his then writing partner Diamond drew on when writing Some Like It Hot. So here. The core idea for Some Like It Hot is said to have originated in a script crafted in the final years of the Weimar Republic. Fanfaren der Liebe, co-written by Robert Thurin and Michael Logan, both former screenwriters at UFA Studio in Berlin, but released in France in 1935 under the French title Fanfare d'amour. The Austrian-born French filmmaker Richard Potier, who was born Ernst Deutsch, directed the French rendition, translating the script by Thurin and Logan with the help of a small team of French screenwriters. However, it was the 1951 West German remake of the film, directed by Kurt Hoffmann, which purportedly caught Wilder's attention. He may well have known of the French production, whose making coincided with the period that he'd spent living amid a small community of exiled German and Austrian Jews, including Thurin, at the Hotel Ansonia in Paris. Small but dirty, dirty but cheap, is composer Friedrich Holländer, a repeat collaborator of Wilder's in Hollywood, and also a resident of the Ansonia, comments in the documentary Cinema's Exiles. Like Wilder, Thurin eventually took up residence in Hollywood, having fled the Nazis in the late 30s, and according to film scholar Gene Phillips, repeatedly tried to coax Wilder into doing an American remake. Thurin passed away in 1957 in a car accident in Munich, a year before the production commenced. Like its later incarnation, the 1951 version of the story centers on a couple of starving male musicians in need of work. They dress as gypsies to play in a gypsy band, put on blackface to play in a jazz band, and most critically, dress as women in the all-girl band called the Alpine Violets. There's even a sharp-tongued female band leader, played by Greta Weiser, who very much anticipates the gestalt of Sweet Sue, played by Joan Shawley in Some Like It Hot. Sweet Sue of the Society Syncopators fame, of course. Wilder felt there was enough of a story in there, perhaps Thurin's avid pitch finally got to him, that he purchased a 10-year option and paid $27,000 for the rights. Wilder would later adamantly deny any close resemblance between the two films. It was a very low-budget, third-class German picture, he later recalled, while Diamond dismissed it as heavy-handed and Germanic, a lot of shaving of chests and trying on wigs. And he opted to set the screenplay that he and Diamond crafted, no gypsies, no blackface, in Prohibition-era Chicago, with his own unconventional comedic take on the 1929 St. Valentine's Day Massacre. But it was the original film's central premise, two jazz musicians in drag, that he pitched to producer Walter Mirisch, arguing that it would make for a wicked screwball comedy. It was, as his mentor Ernst Lubitsch liked to say, the moment when we began to have a picture. For a good amount of time during the Wilder-Diamond production, the film retained a working title of Fanfares of Love, a signpost of the production's winding road. But there's also another much less obvious source of the story. In early 1926, young Billie, then still in his teens, wrote a piece about the arrival of an all-girl English jazz dance troupe in Vienna. Die Tillergirls sind da. You see the reproduction right there on the screen. I quote from his piece. This morning, 34 of the most enticing legs emerged from the Berlin Express train when it arrived at the Westbahnhof station. He begins his reportage, anticipating the train scene that he and Diamond would later reimagine in Chicago 3 decades later. The charming ladies to whom they belonged had stylish traveling outfits on, the piece continues. And one of the last to leave the sleeping car was a tall, elegant lady of a certain age, an old-fashioned hat atop her somewhat flattened head, a lorgnette in her right hand, whirling her left hand in the air in the style of a musical conductor. It's not Miss Sue and her society syncopators, but rather Miss Harley, the shepherdess of these little sheep, who chaperones the Tiller girls, and yet the same giddy, naughty excitement that Joe and Jerry would later enact, like a kid in a pastry shop, as the script note has it, when in disguise among the female jazz players, radiates from young Billie's prose. I quote one more time from the piece. You don't know where to look first. 16 magnificent girls gathered together, cultivated in all parts of the world. those figures, those legs, those little faces. In a follow-up piece, a tongue-in-cheek account of the Viennese sightseeing tour, the Tiller Girls boarding school at the Prater, also published in Die Bühne, Wilder joyfully follows the English dancers on a tour of the St. Stephen's Cathedral, the bar at the Hotel Sacher, a sampling of Viennese coffee, the best in the world, as the Tiller Girls purportedly claim, and onward to the outdoor rides at the Prater. A Tiller girl, and I quote from the piece now here, a Tiller girl is pretty, stylish, and pleasant. Here, I'm going to put up a slide so you get an idea of what Wilder's referring to. A Tiller girl is pretty, stylish, pleasant, reasonably well-educated, grateful, quick-witted, tactful, diplomatic, and sweet, he writes. The Tiller girls captivated the imagination of the 1920s Vienna and Berlin, prompting leading writers and critics from Siegfried Kracauer and Joseph Roth to Alfred Polgar to reflect upon the cultural significance. Kracauer famously wrote in The Mass Ornament of the kick line of the Tiller Girls that it formed, as I quote from Kracauer now, a system of lines which no longer has an erotic meaning, but at best signifies the place where the erotic can be found. For Kracauer, the Tiller Girls reflected a new medium, a further manifestation of modern forces akin to Fordist assembly line production that were gaining traction and shaping urban life in the first decades of the 20th century. Wilder's observations, though more playful in tone, are not far removed in substance to those of Kracauer. They are one single entity, Wilder writes, one single organism, all relying on the others. No individuality here, the absolute democracy. But the main draw of the Tiller Girls was, for many, a strictly libidinal affair. The traveling reviews capitalized on an element of voyeurism and prurient curiosity. One of the early Berlin performances, a review that was choreographed by the theater director Erich Charell, who was born Erich Karl Löwenberg in 1920. The show from 1925 was provocatively titled "Wovon Matrosen träumen," What Sailors Dream of, staged with semi-nude Tiller girls dangling in hammocks above ogling sailors in various states of repose and delight. That same voyeuristic impulse drives the version that Wilder and Diamond concoct from the very first moments that we enter Mozzarella's speakeasy, and with the script annotation, 6 girls in abbreviated costumes doing a frenetic Charleston. I show you the scene, it's very brief.
Well, if you gotta go, that's the way to do it. Follow me.
What'll it be, sir? Booze. Sorry, sir. We only serve coffee.
Coffee.
Scotch coffee, Canadian coffee, sour mash coffee.
Scotch. Make it a democrat. Soda on the side.
Wait a minute.
Well, if you got another pew not so close to the band, how about that one over there?
Sorry, sir, but that's reserved for members of the immediate family.
Hey, I want another cup of coffee. I want another.
Forgive the abrupt stop there. I promised you that I'd show you a Charleston, a rather frenetic one from the film itself. I'm going to jump ahead because I want to kind of, as I said 5 minutes ago, I'd like to bring things to a close here. I'm going to skip over some additional sections that deal with hot jazz. And one of the final band members and final surviving members of the cast, a woman named Gloria Tennis, whom I had the pleasure of interviewing just a couple of years ago. And I'm going to skip to keep us alive here in the final stretch to one more scene from the film. But allow me just a moment to read here. The movie that Wilder and company concocted some 3 decades after his initial encounter with Whiteman is shot through with hot jazz. From the moment the viewers encounter its credit sequence, they find themselves awash in a seductive jazz number, heavy on the horns and strong syncopation, replete with several burlesque-style riffs, as if to say, zowie. And that's, of course, what Joey Brown's character would say. But I'm going to show you the credit sequence here. And by the way, just before we get there, promise. But that's Matty Malneck, and I wanted to show you him because he was a member of the original Whiteman band that traveled to Berlin, and Wilder got to meet him, and it's with Malneck that they composed the numbers for Some Like It Hot. So again, there's just this strong and rootedness in that experience in Weimar, Berlin, that Wilder brings and translates to the screen, again, courtesy of Malneck. Here's the credit sequence. Sorry. Voila. So the medley here leads up to a frenetic and truncated rendition of Runnin' Wild, a popular song composed by Arthur Harrington Gibbs with lyrics by Joe Gray and Leah Wood, released as an ebony jazz tune in 1922, and subsequently performed by jazz greats from Sidney Bechet and Duke Ellington through Paul Whiteman and Benny Goodman. These period-specific songs that Malneck and Wilder carefully selected and arranged have a propulsive function in underscoring the sexually provocative nature of the script. When it comes time to reprise Runnin' Wild in the film's first act, it's Sweet Sue, Joan Chawley's character, who exhorts her syncopators to put a little heat under it. Of course, it's sung by a shimmying, voluptuous ukulele player playing sugarcane Kowalczyk, Marilyn Monroe, aboard a night train bound for Miami, with the telling script note that Monroe is to sing in the style of a hot chorus. And here you have it. This is your reward for being so patient.
Running wild, lost control. Running wild, mighty bold. Feeling gay, reckless too. Carefree mind all the time, never blue. Always going, don't know where. Always showing, I don't care. Don't love nobody. It's not worthwhile. All alone. Running wild.
On a much deeper level, that number evokes the film's cultural and musical antecedents, and much more obliquely, the glorious past of its peripatetic Jewish emigre co-author and director. The very notion of running wild, whether in Berlin, Chicago, Hollywood, or elsewhere, holds an alluring appeal, a return to youth, to a life without worry, unrestricted by hidebound profession or social convention. In their piece on the broader sexual implications of Some Like It Hot, scholars Daniel Lieberfeld and Judith Sanders liken the luxurious and otherwise carefree lives that Joe and Jerry enjoy at the Florida Seminole to that of, and I quote from them, disguised revelers during Carnival, free to adopt identities distinct from their own. Participants in Carnivalesque ritual are permitted, even expected, to temporarily lose control, to go running wild, end quote. They draw further attention to the Prohibition-era setting as another means of inviting transgressions in behavior and desire, even if the dominant social mores remain largely intact, reflecting a more libertine sensibility that was in many respects ahead of its time, or perhaps a return to an earlier, slightly romanticized, and notably freer time for Wilder and his generation of Jewish cultural arbiters in Weimar Berlin. Thank you so much for your attention. Yeah, I rehearsed this for my students at UT New York, and I must have been so caffeinated because I ran right through it much faster. I don't know. I hope I wasn't dragging my heels too much.
Thank you so much, Noah, for a fabulous, very illuminating and enjoyable talk. There must be lots of questions from the audience, and we do have a good 15, 20 minutes for a Q&A. So who would like to kick off the Q&A? Yes, and I'll pass the mic to whoever would like to participate.
Okay, first of all, thank you.
Thank you.
Of course, my brain, with the father that came out of Berlin, was dancing around different ways. I just have a question because I'm being asked help for editing something, and you said that you and someone else chose to take the term Schwarze.
Yeah, Schwarze Girls was the name of the piece.
Yes, and I'm questioning that.
Yes.
From an editor's standpoint.
So that's a really good question. And it was a moment in time that we felt it's a great question. And we were extremely ambivalent. We went back and forth. In fact, Shelley, she translated the piece. And George Floyd had just been murdered. And there were demonstrations in the streets. And this was an important time, not only in the sphere of Black Lives Matter in those protests, but I think for us to kind of rethink our relationship to a scarred past, a bitter past, and I was so worried that it would just draw away from everything. So in the end, we chose to. And again, I'm still ambivalent. I chose to draw on it in this because I feel like finally I've got to use the text. I have to like bring the text to the surface. But at that moment in time, we just were too worried that it was going to be too explosive.
Well, I would just like to say that what I'm thinking with this other person in another situation is to maybe either put it in there or do a little footnote.
Yeah.
Because it is history.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that was a term.
Yeah.
That was.
Yeah.
And I don't think it had the Floyd. It was a term.
Yeah, it was.
At a time.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's all I want to say.
No,
Thank you for
it's a very fair
surfacing that.
point, and I'm still somewhat tortured about it. Yeah.
Other questions, yeah.
Oh no, I'm tortured.
Thanks, Noah, for a fascinating talk. I'll never see that film again quite the same way. I really appreciate it. I couldn't help but thinking of the jazz singer, Jolson's film. And there, the obvious tension is between the traditional Jewish responsibility of the son who basically betrays, or at least to a certain extent betrays what his father expects and becomes wild in some sense.
Yeah.
There was nothing of that in your presentation. In other words, Wilder himself and the other Jewish figures glide effortlessly into this new culture.
Yeah.
So the question is why? I mean, is there no pushback from traditional Jewish cultural, I don't know what, attitude? I mean, I was surprised by how little of that was in your report.
It's a great question. I thank you also for drawing our attention to The Jazz Singer, such an important and influential film that coincides more or less with the time that Wilder's writing from Berlin on jazz. I mentioned the social and sexual panic that kind of takes hold in the American popular press. And you have some very conservative writers in Germany as well who are deeply alarmed by jazz. As for the specific question about the Jewish response, I did not encounter anything, and maybe I haven't dug deep enough. You praise me too highly for the research that I do, Nick. Maybe I haven't done enough research on that question, because I haven't encountered, does it exist? I can't say for certain. It wouldn't surprise me, though, at the same time, I don't know. I think that there was, especially among members of Wilder's generation, there was this desire to release oneself from that, not just from these hidebound professions and social conventions, but I think also from the liberalism of their parents, in a way, to something more open, more libertine, more radical. Wilder himself is not a political radical, but I think that he is quite polymorphously perverse when it comes to when his choices of subjects and even as a writer. So forgive me for making the plug for Billie Wilder and Simon, but I think you get a sense of that mordant humor, that desire to take on taboo subjects, and an impish, almost subversive nature in his style. He's constantly going after the sort of the norms. He's going out and those people who represent the established. There's a great piece in the collection where he's also talking about, and this is I think very applicable today. It's called The Art of Little Ruses, and he's talking about the need for everyone to learn how to lie better. That mendacity actually ought to be taught in school. So that impish wit. But I don't have an answer about in the Jewish press, whether they were writing about jazz. I haven't encountered anything.
I'm very interested in the theme of self-reference in your talk. And I'm wondering, does Wilder pun on his own name in other films? Because this is, that's the argument about this one. That's exactly what he's doing.
Yeah.
Wilde is running him.
Yeah.
Is running her. So does he do that elsewhere?
Oh, I wish I could come up with another one, but no, I think it's here. I think it's here, and I think that
here.
this is where he's really, in a way, luxuriating in this sort of warm bath of the memories of his, being in the happiest moment in his life and the happiest place in his life, and it makes sense. I think that to be honest with you, though, Kathy, I'm not sure that in choosing to incorporate the music, Running Wild, he necessarily had the self-referentiality in mind. Well, on some subconscious level, perhaps, I don't know. But I can't think of him being more self-referential or writing, always co-writing, but co-writing with Is Diamond, another European-born emigre, came as a 9-year-old, so he had no accent, and Wilder almost resented him for that. But Sunset Boulevard, which just experienced its 75th anniversary this year, it was Volker Schlöndorff, I think, who said that really Sunset Boulevard is really all about Weimar Germany and not Hollywood, and that stylistically, in terms of tone, sensibility, and so forth, I think it's much more Some Like It Hot, but there are aspects.
Hi. I studied Weimar German history here at Berkeley, and I was in Berlin this year in January for the Spartacus Aufstand celebrations, and I went to the Helmut Newton photography, like Berlin show, and then there was this talk of degenerate art, and I have a question about this because I see parallels with the U.S. If you see Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, there was a scene where a group of white southern males become they lose control when they see a naked black female described in the same words that described here, and if you look at Germany during that time, like Three Penny Opera, Bertolt Brecht's, or Salon Kitty, or Metropolis, where the bourgeois males, they see the robot and they just kind of lose control, right?
Yeah.
So I know, repressing sexuality of the other is a way to control them, but would you say there's a parallel between what you saw in the American South? By the way, I'm from the South, right? And Germany, because you saw the black and Jewish person mixed together. Do you think there was this fear that the controller would lose agency, right, of his ability to think and control by a more powerful sexuality expressed in a more artistic way by the other, right?
It's a great, great question. And as fate would have it, last night on a very, very long flight from JFK to San Francisco, the in-flight entertainment offered Ryan Coogler's Sinners, which I hadn't yet seen and which I watched. And I think to a certain degree, kind of in a horror, using a kind of more horror vernacular, thematizes some of those same aspects. What you were saying earlier about Three Penny Opera and the kind of import, and this is the Ernst Krenek opera that I mentioned before as well, Johnny spielt auf. Jazz and the attachment to America, I think, is in the volume that Marty and Tony put together in the 1990s, the Weimar Source Book. there's a whole section that deals with this notion of Americanismus, this kind of obsession with all things American. And Wilder was really caught up in that. He was giving a tour of a Hollywood writer, director who came to visit in Berlin, and it was there that he learned the art of the cocktail, of the martini, and he was a lifelong martini. He was obsessed with boxing, was obsessed with fast cars, was obsessed with speed in general. Can't answer the question about this obsession with boxing. What I will say is I think that it was part and parcel of that broader sphere and the obsession with all things American. And I think that Black performers who came from the United States, Josephine Baker, Sidney Bechet, and company, were looked up with that same sort of admiration and to a certain degree, as I quoted, also fetish as well. I don't want to look away from that. And you're making me think also, continuing to make me think about that piece, Schwarze Girls, which in German just means black girls. So it's not derogatorily in the Yiddish use, I think, but black girls.
Other questions? Yeah, Steve Show.
Hi, thanks so much. The conclusion really brought this home for me, and I'm wondering, Wilder's known for having worked in many genres. So are there lines of historical genealogy that you're drawing from from his other films in this project? And then the larger question is just this issue of auteurism and how history and textual reading intersect with each other. I'm curious as to how you would kind of generally speak about that.
Well, let me take up the second one first, if I may, just because it's top of mind, the question of auteurism. And it's ironic that, in Andrew Sarris's Bible of auteurism, the American cinema from 1968, that Wilder's really kind of a second or third rank figure. He's not there in the upper echelons of that pantheon, along with Hawks and Fuller and Hitchcock and Lang and others. And so people have, I think, been reluctant because of his omnivorous approach to cinema and the multi-genres, and always writing with a partner. And he did so because he came to the States in 1934 and didn't have, at least to his mind, sufficient grasp of the English language. And so he'd always write with American-born, or in the case of Diamond, American-raised writers. To your first, what was the first part of your question? So I took up the auteurism question. The first one was about the other films that kind of are. Look, in the short interpretive biography that I need to finish once I wrap this thing up for Yale, that will cover his entire life and career. So in that work, absolutely. In the case of the cultural history of Some Like It Hot, I do take up other moments in his career and other films when they lend themselves to kind of enriching our understanding of that film. And that's kind of what I attempted to do here tonight. There's a moment when I'm talking about the collaboration between Wilder and Is Diamond, and in that chapter, the happiest couple in Hollywood, which is ironic because his first collaborator, Charlie Brackett, there was a piece in the popular press that used that term, but it's really his collaboration with Is Diamond that I think was famously not just the longevity, but also a really simpatico relationship between the two. But in that chapter, I talk about his earlier works as a writer, and in particular, Hold Back the Dawn. And when Charles Boyer does not deliver a page of dialogue, when he's for those of you who know this film, Charles Boyer plays George Iscovescu is the name. He's a Romanian dancer. The script by Wilder, and he's in Mexicali. He's in the border town. He's trying to get his visa so that he can make his way into the United States. There's a page of dialogue that's not read, and he's having this conversation with a cockroach. And Charles Boyer didn't want to do it. And this is the moment when Wilder decides, you know what? If they're not going to read the text that I have on the page, I'm going to direct. And so he becomes a director. But I go back to earlier films like that, and to his earlier collaborations too, with Hawks, Ball of Fire, for example. to scrap certain sections tonight, but there are moments when Gene Krupa in that film, Ball of Fire, that Wilder wrote together with Brackett, is doing that hot jazz, drum boogie, the number with Barbara Stanwyck, when how can you forget? But so there are moments when I will kind of head back to those films and then take things forward. But in the Yale Jewish Lives volume, it'll be a chronological account of Wilder, his life, and his career.
We have time for maybe one or two final questions before wrapping up. Who else would like to jump in at this point? Yes, maybe.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you. Oh, okay. Thanks for the talk. Super interesting. My question is this. I mean, we all read a few books about Billy Wilder, and this adds to that knowledge. Yeah. So the idea of how the memories of the Weimar Republic affects his work now is something that we're somewhat familiar. So it always makes me wonder, though, how does the present of his time, say 1959, in the recalling of those memories of the Weimar Republic affects those memories themselves? Meaning, how does the moment of his present affect the memory of the past?
Oh, my God. That is a great question. And do I take a swat at it? Yes, I will. And I will do so under the banner of the American puritanical morality and sexual mores. He was constantly at odds with the Production Code Administration, also known as the Hays Code, always trying to kind of push the envelope. And I think on censorship, and in particular with respect to social and sexual mores. And so in 1959, when he's writing together with, or 58 it begins, but it doesn't matter for our sake, 59, writing with his diamond, Some Like It Hot, it's set in 1929 Chicago, Prohibition-era Chicago, for the reasons that he could then incorporate the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and as I point out in a little aside there, also to make it conceivable to an American audience in 1959 that two straight male musicians would dress up as women. But even that, the cross-dressing aspect of the film and applying pressure to American social and sexual mores, I think is very much of that moment. But of course, it's set 30 years prior. And it's set ostensibly in Chicago, when I'm arguing here that to a large degree it's actually set in 1920s Berlin. I hope I did justice. That's a great question. I'd like to answer in a more sophisticated. One of the things, by the way, when I was a graduate student at Berkeley, I remember this because this was very important. I would write papers, and I would often hear it's under-theorized. No, it's under-theorized, and maybe this is my revenge tonight for being always under-theorized. Now it's completely the other side. But there is, you will see, there's a little bit of good old Siegfried in there. Dr. Krakauer rears his head. But otherwise, your question, that required a much more sophisticated, much more complex, and not an under-theorized response. So forgive me if I didn't get it. Denise.
I think, this last response to Avi's question actually put the whole thing into perspective for me. And but I also wanted to go back to Marty's question about the jazz singer, because, at the ending of the jazz singer is about, bringing the jazz home and somehow reconciling tradition with the kind of whole new exuberance and finding a new voice in that, right? So and I and here that kind of identity struggle is not what is at stake here, but it is that whole sort of pushing the envelope and the kind of ambiguity and the sexual innuendo throughout, and the cross-dressing, and it doesn't. The final line is nobody is perfect, right? Yeah. So okay. So
there's a script note after that says they're not sure that audiences are quite ready to know what actually comes of Osgood Fielding III, Joey Brown's character, who utters that line.
Right. So that is.
So again, going back to your question about 59. Sorry.
Yeah. So that is the kind of radical bit here. And, so I'm wondering if you could also say a little more about how that speaks to us today, So,
Yeah.
I mean, if we are thinking about an exile
Right.
narrative and how, what we get out of that today.
Yeah.
And, why you turned to this material again, and what the overall arc of your project is.
Yeah.
It's a big...
It's a great question. Let me just do this, if I may. So I started tonight by talking about the book project, and what I was reading from now is in the very first pages of that book. If we flash to the seventh and final chapter of the book, I'm writing about the Broadway show of Some Like It Hot that just had a great success on Broadway and has been traveling the country in recent months. The Josephine Baker section had actually initially existed in the seventh chapter, because what the Broadway show does is, to a large degree, and I'm in full agreement with the masterminds behind that production, is to do what Wilder couldn't do in 1959. It's an entirely multi-ethnic cast. It deals with the question. 1929 deals with the question of the Jim Crow South. And no, you go to Florida. You're not going to Florida in 1929, not if you're black. And so they actually set it in San Diego, which is where it is. That's where they shot the film, at the Hotel del Coronado in San Diego. The film also has a non-binary lead who plays Joe and Josephine. And who really does so with a kind of missionary zeal in this fraught political moment that we're currently living through. And it's enormously successful. So in a way, that seventh chapter, and I'm still a little bit questioning whether the Josephine Baker section belongs when talking about Wilder and jazz. At this moment in time, I think it does. But initially, it began in talking about the production. And to your first part of your question, he's the jazz singer, and at the end, how it kind of habituates jazz in the kind of mainstream to a certain degree. That's precisely what Paul Whiteman is doing. And fittingly enough, Paul Whiteman's the ticket to Berlin for Wilder. He follows Paul Whiteman. He becomes something of a press agent for Whiteman. You'd almost think of Tony Curtis's role as Sidney Falco in Sweet Smell of Success. But he becomes this kind of press agent for Whiteman, as well as being a journalist. And by the way, Wilder kind of, those are very porous borders for him. When they're working on People on Sunday in the summer of 1929, he writes these two pieces in the press. And on the one hand, he's the person who provided the story for People on Sunday. On the other hand, there he is writing these kind of glowing reports that he's then placing. So it's very smart. He kind of knew social media before social media existed. And definitely was very good when it came to the promotion. And took heat for that, by the way. I mean, I do think that Saris and company, in terms of the more tourist approach to cinema, were a little bit reluctant to have Wilder make it to the upper echelons, also because of the commercialism of his work.
Great. Well, we could talk for several more hours, but fortunately for those interested, there's a graduate student workshop tomorrow from 11 to 1 with lunch served. We'll be discussing the film you just mentioned, People on Sunday, which Wilder wrote. So we hope many of you will join us for that. But for now, please join me in thanking Noah Isenberg for a fabulous talk.
Thank you so much for coming tonight. It's a real pleasure being back. Really appreciate it. And thank you for all the questions. My pleasure.